When I got married, I kept a secret worth millions. And thank God I did, because just 1 week later, my mother-in-law knocked on my door with a death sentence bearing my name. They wanted to take it all. But they forgot that my grandmother had taught me how to fight. And now, it was time for them to learn that lesson. My name is Claire Whitman, though I wasn't born with that last name. I earned it through a wedding that felt like a fairy tale but turned into a nightmare faster than I could have ever imagined. I'm 31 years old, and until very recently, I thought I knew what love looked like. I thought I understood family. I was wrong about so many things. But I wasn't wrong about protecting what my grandmother left me. And I wasn't wrong about fighting back when someone tried to steal it. My grandmother, Eleanor Stone, was a force of nature. She built her wealth from nothing, starting with a small boutique in Manhattan that grew into a chain of luxury stores across the East Coast. By the time she passed away 2 years ago, she owned 3 beachfront estates, a penthouse in the city, and investments that would make most people's heads spin. But more than the money, more than the properties, she left me something far more valuable. She taught me to recognize predators. She taught me that not everyone who smiles at you wishes you well. She taught me that family isn't always found in blood, and that sometimes the most dangerous wolves wear the finest pearls. I met Ethan Whitman at a charity gala in Boston. He was handsome in that effortless way some men are, with dark hair that always looked perfectly tousled and a smile that could disarm anyone. He worked in finance, came from old money, and seemed genuinely interested in my work as a business consultant. We talked for hours that first night about everything from art to economics to our favorite childhood memories. He made me laugh. He made me feel seen. 3 months later, he proposed on a rooftop overlooking the harbor, and I said yes without hesitation. I should have noticed the red flags earlier. I should have paid attention to the way his mother, Margaret Whitman, looked at me during our first meeting. Her smile never quite reached her eyes, and when she hugged me, it felt more like an assessment than an embrace. She asked too many questions about my work, about my finances, about what my grandmother had left me. At the time, I thought she was just being thorough, the way wealthy families often are when a new person enters their circle. I told her I worked in consulting, that I managed my own affairs, and kept the details vague. Something in my gut told me to hold back, and I've never been more grateful for my instincts. The wedding was beautiful. We held it at the Whitman family estate in Connecticut, a sprawling property with gardens that seemed to go on forever. 200 guests attended, mostly Ethan's family and friends. My side was smaller, just a few close friends and distant relatives. My grandmother was gone, and she had been my real family. As I walked down the aisle in a dress that cost more than most people's cars, I felt a strange mixture of happiness and unease. Ethan looked at me with what I thought was love. His mother looked at me like I was an item on an inventory list. During the reception, Margaret made sure to pull me aside more than once. She'd cornered me near the champagne fountain, her fingers adorned with diamonds that caught the light like tiny warnings. She spoke in that particular tone wealthy women use when they want to cut you without raising their voices. She mentioned how I came from such a different background, how the Whitman name carried certain expectations, how important it was that I understand my role in the family. She didn't say I wasn't good enough, but she didn't have to. Every word dripped with the implication that I was climbing above my station, that I should be grateful to be marrying into their world. I looked her straight in the eye and smiled. I told her that I understood expectations very well, and that I hoped she would come to understand mine. Her expression flickered, just for a moment, with something that might have been surprise or anger. She recovered quickly, patting my arm with a condescending little laugh. But I saw it. The mask had slipped, and underneath was something cold and calculating. The honeymoon was a blur of Italian coastlines and luxury hotels. Ethan was attentive and loving, but I noticed something new in the way he spoke about money. He kept suggesting that we should combine our finances, that it would make things simpler, that married couples should share everything. I deflected each time, saying I wanted to keep my accounts separate for now, that I was used to managing my own affairs. He seemed frustrated but didn't push too hard. I thought maybe he just wanted to feel more connected. I didn't realize he was laying groundwork for his mother's plan. When we returned home, I did something I hadn't told Ethan about. I met with my grandmother's lawyer, Mr. Caldwell. He was an older gentleman with silver hair and sharp eyes who had managed my grandmother's affairs for 30 years. He'd called me before the wedding, expressing concerns about some inquiries he'd received. Someone had been trying to find out details about Eleanor Stone's estate, asking questions about beneficiaries and asset distribution. The inquiries had come through legal channels but felt invasive. Wrong. Mr. Caldwell and I sat in his office overlooking the harbor, and he laid out the situation with the precision of a surgeon. Someone was fishing for information, someone with resources and legal connections. We didn't have proof, but we both suspected it was the Whitmans. He suggested that I immediately transfer all of my inherited assets into an irrevocable trust with me as the sole trustee and beneficiary. It would create a legal fortress around my grandmother's legacy, making it nearly impossible for anyone to access or claim any part of it without my explicit written consent. The paperwork would take a few days, but it would be ironclad. I signed everything that afternoon. Every property, every investment account, every asset my grandmother had left me was placed into the Eleanor Stone Trust. Only Mr. Caldwell and I knew the full details. I didn't tell Ethan. Something in my bones told me not to, and I've learned to trust that feeling. My grandmother used to say that intuition is just pattern recognition your conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. My subconscious was screaming warnings I was only beginning to hear. 1 week after we returned from our honeymoon, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, everything shattered. I was in our apartment, a beautiful space in a converted brownstone that Ethan had insisted we rent despite my protests that it was too expensive. I was making coffee when I heard the knock at the door. Sharp. Insistent. The kind of knock that means trouble. I opened the door to find Margaret standing there with a man I didn't recognize. He wore a suit and carried a leather briefcase. Behind them was Ethan, looking pale and uncomfortable. Margaret swept past me without waiting for an invitation, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor like a countdown. The man introduced himself as a notary public. My stomach dropped. Margaret settled herself on our sofa as if she owned the place. Perhaps she thought she did. She pulled a stack of documents from an expensive leather folder and spread them across our coffee table. Her smile was triumphant, the smile of a hunter who has cornered her prey. She started talking about family planning, about integrating assets, about how it was time to make everything official now that I was truly part of the Whitman family. Her words were sugarcoating poison. I picked up the top document and started reading. My hands shook, but I kept my face neutral. There it was, in legal language designed to confuse and overwhelm, a request to transfer control of my grandmother's estate to a Whitman family trust. They wanted me to sign over everything. The houses, the investments, the businesses, everything Eleanor Stone had built, everything she had left specifically to me. They wanted it absorbed into their family wealth. And they expected me to just sign it away. I looked up at Margaret. She was still smiling, but her eyes were hard. I looked at Ethan. He couldn't meet my gaze. The notary was studying his phone, probably wishing he was anywhere else. The room felt too hot, too small, like the walls were closing in, but underneath my shock and anger, something else was rising. My grandmother's voice in my head, steady and strong. When sharks circle, you don't play dead, you show your teeth. I asked Margaret where she got these documents, where she found the information about my grandmother's estate. My voice was calmer than I felt, each word measured and cold. She waved her hand dismissively, and said that Ethan had mentioned my little inheritance during a family discussion about finances. She said it was time to be practical, that married couples share everything, that this was just smart planning. She actually used the word smart, as if I was too stupid to see what she was doing. I picked up the entire stack of papers and threw them across the room, documents scattered everywhere like oversized confetti. The notary jumped. Ethan made a strangled sound. Margaret's smile finally dropped. I told her that she had just committed attempted fraud, that these documents were created without my knowledge or consent, and that if I ever saw my name on anything she prepared again without my explicit permission, I would have her arrested. My voice was shaking with rage, but every word was clear. Margaret's mask fell completely. She stood up, her face flushed with anger, and started yelling about how I was ungrateful, how I didn't understand what it meant to be a Whitman, how I needed to learn respect and obedience. She said that last word like I was a dog she was training. She said I was ruining my marriage before it even started, that I was being selfish and secretive, that Ethan deserved a wife who trusted his family. She said all of this in front of the notary, who was now backing toward the door, clearly wanting no part of whatever storm was breaking. I walked to the door and opened it. I looked at the notary and told him to leave and forget everything he'd seen. He practically ran. Then I turned to Margaret and Ethan. I told them that my grandmother's estate was none of their business, that it was protected by legal trusts they couldn't touch, and that if they ever tried something like this again, I wouldn't just threaten legal action. I would follow through with every resource at my disposal. Margaret called me a liar, said I was bluffing, said I didn't have that kind of power. I smiled and told her she was welcome to test that theory. She left in a fury of expensive perfume and threats. Ethan stayed behind, looking lost and guilty. He tried to tell me that his mother had pressured him, that he'd only mentioned my inheritance in passing, that he never thought she would do something like this. I asked him if he knew what she was planning when he came to the door with her. He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. He'd known. Maybe not all the details, but he'd known enough. He'd chosen his mother over me, and we'd only been married for 3 weeks. I told Ethan to leave. He tried to argue, tried to explain, tried to make excuses. I wasn't interested in any of them. I needed time to think, and I needed him gone while I did it. He finally left, slamming the door behind him like a child, throwing a tantrum. I stood in our apartment, surrounded by scattered legal documents, and called Mr. Caldwell. He answered on the second ring. I told him everything. Mr. Caldwell's voice was grim but unsurprised. He told me that the trust was secure, that Margaret had no legal avenue to touch my assets, but that I needed to be prepared for her to try again. People like Margaret Whitman didn't accept defeat gracefully. They retaliated. He advised me to document everything, to save every email and text message, to record any conversations I legally could. He said we needed to prepare for a fight, because Margaret had just shown her hand and she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted, or was forced to stop. The next few days were tense and quiet. Ethan came home late, avoided conversation, and slept on the couch. His mother called constantly, but he stopped answering in front of me. I could hear him sometimes, late at night, speaking in hushed tones in the other room. I knew he was talking to her. I knew they were planning something. The apartment that had briefly felt like home now felt like a battlefield with a ceasefire that wouldn't last. 2 weeks after the confrontation, I received an email from Mr. Caldwell marked urgent. He'd received a formal request for early access to the Eleanor Stone Trust assets. The request included documentation that appeared to show my signature authorizing the transfer. I stared at my phone, my hands going cold. I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't authorized anything. Someone had forged my signature. I called Mr. Caldwell immediately. He'd already suspected forgery and had started preliminary verification. He sent me copies of the documents. I studied them carefully, my anger building with each page. The signature looked like mine at first glance, but it wasn't perfect. Whoever had done this was skilled, probably a professional, but they weren't quite good enough. The T in my last name was slightly wrong, and I always made a specific flourish on the C in Claire that wasn't present. These were details only someone who regularly examined my signature would notice, but they were there. I grabbed my laptop and started pulling up every piece of documentation I could find. Bank statements, credit card receipts, anything that showed when I'd been where and doing what. If someone claimed I'd signed these documents on a specific date, I wanted proof that I'd been somewhere else. I found what I needed. The date on the forged documents was during our honeymoon, a day Ethan and I had been on a boat tour off the Amalfi Coast. I had photos, receipts, timestamps on social media posts. There was no possible way I could have signed anything in New York on that date. Mr. Caldwell and I had evidence of forgery. He advised me that this was now a criminal matter. Someone had committed fraud, and that someone had access to documents and information that could only have come from inside the Whitman family. We both knew who was responsible. The question was whether I wanted to pursue criminal charges or try to resolve this privately. He didn't push me either way, but he made it clear that private resolution meant backing down, accepting vulnerability, and probably facing more attempts in the future. Margaret would see it as weakness. I thought about my grandmother. I thought about the hours she'd worked, the risks she'd taken, the empire she'd built from nothing. I thought about her sitting me down when I was younger, telling me that the world would try to take from me simply because I was a woman, simply because I had something others wanted. She told me never to apologize for protecting what was mine, never to feel guilty for fighting back when someone tried to steal from me. She said that real power wasn't in being liked or being nice. Real power was in knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone diminish it. I told Mr. Caldwell to file a police report and initiate a full investigation. I wanted every document examined, every transaction traced, every person involved identified. I wanted a forensic audit of how these forged documents had been created and who had authorized them. I wanted everything documented and preserved for potential criminal prosecution. Mr. Caldwell said it would be expensive, time-consuming, and would likely destroy any remaining relationship I had with the Whitman family. I told him I didn't care. They'd already destroyed the relationship when they decided to commit fraud. The investigation moved quickly once law enforcement became involved. Forensic document examiners confirmed the forgery within days. Digital forensics traced the documents back to a computer belonging to Margaret's personal assistant. Phone records showed multiple calls between Margaret and a document specialist known for creating realistic forgeries for estate planning purposes. It wasn't definitive proof that Margaret had personally ordered the forgery, but the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. Her assistant claimed she'd acted on Margaret's explicit instructions. The document specialist, facing his own criminal charges, confirmed he'd been hired by someone matching Margaret's description. The police contacted Margaret for questioning. That's when everything exploded. She hired a team of expensive lawyers who immediately started spinning the narrative. They claimed it was all a misunderstanding, that Margaret had only been trying to help me with estate planning, that her assistant had misunderstood instructions. They painted me as a paranoid, ungrateful daughter-in-law who was causing problems over nothing. They leaked stories to social media, suggesting I was trying to extort the Whitman family. It was classic damage control, but it wasn't working. The evidence was too clear, and the authorities weren't buying their excuses. Ethan showed up at the apartment 3 days after his mother was questioned by police. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days. He begged me to drop the charges, said his mother was falling apart, said the publicity was destroying the family's reputation. He actually said that. He wanted me to sacrifice justice for a reputation his mother had already destroyed through her own actions. I asked him if he knew what she'd done. He admitted he'd known she was trying to access my trust but claimed he didn't know about the forgery. I didn't believe him. I told Ethan that his mother had committed multiple felonies. She'd forged legal documents, attempted to steal millions of dollars, and then lied to police about it. I told him that if the situation were reversed, if I'd done this to his family, he'd be demanding prosecution. He couldn't argue with that. He just stood there, looking helpless and lost, asking what he was supposed to do. I told him he should have done something weeks ago. He should have stood up to his mother the moment she showed up with those documents. He should have protected me instead of enabling her. But he hadn't, and now we were all dealing with the consequences. Ethan tried a different approach. He said the investigation was hurting his father's business, that investors were nervous, that the family was facing financial problems because of the scandal. He wanted me to feel guilty, to see myself as the cause of their troubles. It didn't work. I pointed out that Margaret had caused this, not me. She'd made the choice to commit fraud. She'd created the scandal. All I'd done was refuse to be a victim. If their business was suffering, it was because they'd built it on a foundation of entitlement and corruption. Maybe it was time for that foundation to crack. He left after that, and I didn't try to stop him. I packed a bag that night, took the photo of my grandmother that always sat on my nightstand, and left the apartment. I drove to one of the beach houses, a beautiful property in Cape Cod that my grandmother had loved. It was early autumn, the tourist season winding down, and the house felt peaceful in a way the city never had. I needed that peace. I needed space to think and plan without Ethan hovering, without the constant tension of living in the eye of a storm I hadn't created. The investigation continued through September and into October. More evidence emerged. Margaret's phone records showed she'd been planning this for months, possibly since before the wedding. She'd contacted lawyers about trust law, researched ways to access protected assets, even hired a private investigator to dig into my financial background. It was premeditated, calculated, and thorough. She'd seen me as an obstacle to accessing wealth she felt entitled to, and she'd methodically planned to remove that obstacle. The only thing she hadn't counted on was me fighting back. The district attorney's office was building a strong case. They charged Margaret with forgery, attempted fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. Her lawyers tried everything to get the charges dropped or reduced. They offered to settle civilly, to pay damages, to issue public apologies. The prosecutors weren't interested. This wasn't a civil dispute. It was criminal activity, and they intended to prosecute it fully. Margaret's preliminary hearing was scheduled for November. In the meantime, the story had leaked to the press. Local news outlets started reporting on it, then regional papers, then national media. The narrative was too good to ignore. Wealthy socialite attempts to steal daughter-in-law's inheritance through forgery and fraud. Reporters camped outside the Whitman estate. Margaret stopped appearing at her usual social functions. The charity board she sat on quietly asked her to step down. Her carefully cultivated image as a pillar of the community was crumbling, and everyone was watching it happen. Ethan called me repeatedly during this time. I didn't answer most of his calls, but occasionally I'd read his text messages. They were increasingly desperate. He said his mother wasn't eating, wasn't sleeping, couldn't handle the public humiliation. He said I'd destroyed her life. He said I was being cruel and vindictive. He said if I ever loved him, I'd drop the charges and let his family heal. Each message was more manipulative than the last, trying to make me responsible for consequences his mother had brought on herself. I finally responded to one of his messages. I wrote that I hadn't destroyed anything. His mother had made choices, criminal choices, and now she was facing the results of those choices. I said that real cruelty was stealing from someone who trusted you. Real vindictiveness was forging documents to rob someone of their inheritance. I told him that if he couldn't see the difference between justice and revenge, then we had nothing left to discuss. He replied asking about our marriage. I told him to expect divorce papers. I filed for divorce the next morning. My lawyer handled everything, making it as clean and simple as possible. I wanted nothing from Ethan except my freedom. I didn't ask for alimony or a settlement. I just wanted out. The marriage had lasted less than 4 months, and most of that time had been spent in conflict and betrayal. It felt less like ending a marriage, and more like escaping a trap I'd barely avoided. The divorce was finalized faster than the criminal case against Margaret. Ethan didn't contest anything. I think he was relieved to have it over with, to remove himself from the situation before it damaged him further. His family's reputation was already in tatters. The Whitman name, once associated with old money and social prestige, was now synonymous with greed and criminality. His father's business lost several major contracts. Investors pulled out. The family that had looked down on me for not being their equal was now discovering what it felt like to fall. Margaret's trial was set for January. Her lawyers negotiated a plea deal in December. She agreed to plead guilty to forgery and attempted fraud in exchange for probation, community service, a substantial fine, and a permanent record. She would avoid jail time, but her reputation was permanently destroyed. She was required to issue a formal apology, though she never contacted me directly. I heard through Mr. Caldwell that she'd been forced to resign from all her charity boards, country club memberships, and social positions. The woman who'd tried to steal my inheritance had lost everything she'd valued in the process. I didn't attend the hearing where she entered her plea. I didn't need to see her face or hear her apology. Mr. Caldwell represented my interests, and that was enough. What mattered to me wasn't watching her fall. What mattered was that she could never do this to anyone else, that there was a legal record of what she'd tried to do, that she'd faced real consequences for her actions. My grandmother used to say that justice isn't about revenge, it's about creating accountability. Margaret was finally being held accountable. With the legal matters resolved, I turned my attention to the future. I'd spent months in defensive mode, protecting what was mine and fighting off attacks. Now it was time to move forward, to actually do something meaningful with what my grandmother had left me. I thought about her legacy, about what she would have wanted. She hadn't spent her life building wealth just to have it sit in trust accounts. She'd believed in using resources to create opportunities, especially for women who faced the same barriers she once had. I decided to transform one of the beach houses into something that would honor her memory and help others. The Cape Cod property was perfect, large enough to accommodate my vision but still feeling like a home rather than an institution. I hired architects and contractors to renovate it into a center that would provide legal education and support for young women, particularly those studying business law or facing asset protection issues. I wanted to create a place where women could learn to defend themselves against financial manipulation, where they could understand their rights and develop the tools to protect their futures. The project took 6 months. We kept the character of the house while making it functional as an educational space. Library rooms filled with legal resources, conference rooms for workshops and seminars, guest rooms for scholars in residence, a modern kitchen where visiting professionals could gather informally, gardens where people could walk and think. Every detail was considered, every space designed to be both beautiful and purposeful. My grandmother would have loved it. I named it the Eleanor Stone Foundation. The official opening was in June, almost exactly a year after my disastrous wedding. I invited legal professionals, women's advocates, journalists, and anyone else who might be interested in our mission. Mr. Caldwell attended, of course, and gave a speech about my grandmother's legacy and her commitment to empowering women through knowledge and resources. I spoke too, telling a carefully edited version of what had happened to me, explaining why this work mattered, why women needed to understand how to protect themselves from those who would exploit them. The response was overwhelming. Within weeks, we had applications from women across the country wanting to participate in our programs. Law professors offered to teach workshops. Experienced attorneys volunteered their time for one-on-one consultations. Financial planners created educational materials about asset protection. What I'd imagined as a small regional program quickly grew into something much larger. The Eleanor Stone Foundation became exactly what I'd hoped, a place where women learned not just to survive but to thrive, to fight back, to refuse to be victims. During the renovation, the contractors had found something unexpected under the floorboards of what used to be my grandmother's bedroom. It was a small wooden box, old and weathered, locked with a tarnished brass clasp. I'd opened it carefully, not sure what to expect. Inside were letters, photos, and a single piece of paper with my grandmother's handwriting. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded, but the words were clear. When you face wolves in family clothing, remember that wolves fear fire, not kindness. I had that quote engraved on a plaque in the foundation's entrance hall. Every person who walked through those doors would see it, would understand the philosophy behind everything we did. We weren't teaching women to be cruel or vindictive. We were teaching them to be strong, to recognize danger, to protect themselves and what they'd worked for. We were teaching them that sometimes the greatest kindness you can show yourself is refusing to be kind to those who want to hurt you. I thought a lot about Margaret during those months. I didn't hate her anymore. Hatred requires too much energy, and I had better things to do with mine. But I understood her better now. She'd lived her entire life believing that wealth and status were the only things that mattered, that image was everything, that people like me were threats to be neutralized or resources to be exploited. She'd never learned that real power comes from building something meaningful, from standing up for what's right even when it's hard, from caring about more than just your own comfort and status. In a strange way, Margaret had given me a gift. She'd shown me exactly who I didn't want to become. She'd pushed me to fight for myself in ways I might never have otherwise. She'd made me stronger by trying to destroy me. The version of Claire who'd walked down the aisle a year ago was gone. In her place was someone who knew her worth, who wouldn't tolerate abuse or exploitation, who understood that kindness without boundaries is just another word for victimhood. Ethan tried to contact me once more, about 8 months after the divorce was finalized. He sent an email asking if we could meet for coffee, saying he wanted to apologize and explain. I thought about it for exactly 30 seconds before deleting the message without responding. There was nothing he could say that would change what had happened. There was no explanation that would make his choices acceptable. He'd had opportunities to stand up for me, to protect me, to be the partner I'd needed. He'd chosen his mother every time. That was answer enough. The Eleanor Stone Foundation grew throughout its first year. We developed partnerships with law schools, created scholarship programs, hosted conferences on women's financial rights. I split my time between managing the foundation and continuing my consulting work, finding ways to make them complement each other. The beach house where I'd fled during the worst of the legal battles became my permanent home. I loved waking up to the sound of waves, loved the space and peace it offered. The city apartment where I'd lived with Ethan felt like a lifetime ago. I started dating again eventually, though I was careful about it. I'd learned expensive lessons about trust and vulnerability. I wasn't eager to repeat those mistakes. When men asked about my previous marriage, I kept my answer simple. It didn't work out. We wanted different things. I'm focused on my work now. Most people didn't push for details. The few who did usually backed off when they sensed I wasn't interested in sharing. My private life was mine again, and I guarded it carefully. The foundation's second year brought new challenges and opportunities. We expanded our programming, brought in more instructors, reached more women. I hired a small staff to help manage daily operations, freeing me to focus on strategic planning and fundraising. We secured grants from several major foundations interested in women's empowerment and legal education. The work was exhausting and rewarding in equal measure. Every woman who walked through our doors, learned to protect herself, and went back into the world stronger, made everything worthwhile. I thought about my grandmother constantly during this time. I wished she could see what I'd built with her legacy. I wished I could tell her how right she'd been about so many things. I wished I could thank her for teaching me to fight. But in some ways, I felt like she did know. The foundation was my conversation with her, my way of carrying forward everything she'd taught me. Every woman we helped was a tribute to Eleanor Stone's belief that power should be used to lift others up, not knock them down. Margaret's story ended quietly. She moved out of state about a year after her plea deal, unable to handle the constant reminders of her fall from grace. I heard through social connections that she and her husband had separated, though I never confirmed it. Ethan stayed in Boston but kept a low profile. His father's business had recovered somewhat but never regained its former prestige. The Whitman name would always carry the stain of what Margaret had done. I felt no satisfaction in their struggles, but I felt no guilt either. They'd made their choices, and choices have consequences. Standing on the deck of the beach house on a cool September evening, exactly 2 years after the day Margaret had shown up with forged documents, I reflected on how much had changed. The sun was setting over the ocean, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The waves crashed rhythmically against the shore, constant and eternal. I held a glass of wine and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not happiness exactly, though I had moments of that too. But a deep, settled peace that came from knowing I'd fought for myself and won, that I'd taken pain and transformed it into purpose, that I'd honored my grandmother's legacy in the best way possible. The Eleanor Stone Foundation had helped over 300 women in its first 2 years. 300 women who now understood their legal rights, who could identify financial manipulation, who knew how to protect their assets and their futures. 300 women who would be harder to victimize, harder to exploit, harder to steal from. Each one of them was a small victory against people like Margaret, against systems that treated women's wealth as something to be managed by others, against the assumption that we needed protection rather than power. I'd learned that revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about construction, about building something so strong and meaningful that it outlasts whatever damage someone tried to do to you. Margaret had wanted to steal my grandmother's legacy. Instead, she'd inspired me to multiply it, to turn 3 properties into a movement, to transform personal pain into collective empowerment. If that wasn't the ultimate revenge, I didn't know what was. My phone buzzed with an email from Mr. Caldwell. Another woman was seeking help with a trust dispute involving her late mother's estate and a predatory stepfather. Could the foundation take her case? I typed back immediately, yes. This was exactly why we existed. This was the work that mattered. I finished my wine, watched the last traces of sunset fade from the sky, and went inside to start preparing for tomorrow. There was always another fight, another woman who needed support, another chance to honor what my grandmother had taught me. The wolves were still out there, still circling, still looking for prey. But we were teaching women to recognize them, to fight back, to refuse to be victims. We were teaching them that sometimes the only way to protect what's yours is to show your teeth and remind the wolves that you can bite too. Margaret Whitman had tried to teach me submission. Instead, she'd taught me strength. She'd tried to steal my legacy. Instead, she'd helped me build one that would outlast us both.